ash scours the cliff in grey sheets. Fingon hangs from a jag of iron with blood slick on his fingers, while above him, Maedhros sways newly cut free, pale as frost and half senseless in the beat of great wings. Orc horns rise from the chasms, the cold smells of metal and old fire. Maedhros. Fingon cries through the smoke, and the prince looks down, hears him, and does not descend. Below them, Angband opens like a furnace mouth beneath a falling star of white flesh. If this darker road through Middle-earth draws you in, leave a like, subscribe for more lore what-ifs, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Every distant shore listening makes Beleriand feel a little less lost. Thorondor rose with a labouring cry, his pinions striking sparks from the black stone, and in his talons, Maedhros, son of Feanor, hung limp and bleeding, his right wrist hacked away by Fingon's own blade. The air was full of cinders. Beneath, on a narrow shelf where the rocks sweated heat from the furnaces of Angband, Fingon fought for purchase with one hand, while the broken links of Maedhros' chain lashed and rang around him. Orc archers were already clambering from crevices. Their armour scraped the cliff like beetles against slate. Fingon had come alone, because once, before Oath and Fire and the white ships at Alqualonda, he and Maedhros had laughed together in the light of Valinor. He had come because shame in the house of the Noldor had grown too large for words, and because sometimes one deed may stand where speeches rot. He had found his cousin not on some low dungeon wall, but hung upon the face of Thangorodrim, where no rescue seemed possible to any strength born in Arda. So he had sung in despair, and the song had climbed the stone. Maedhros had answered. Manwë had heard. Thorondor had come. Everything after that happened within heartbeats and remained for centuries. The eagle had borne Maedhros from the chain, but not from danger. Hidden shafts hissed upward and bit into Thorondor's breast. The great bird reeled. Fingon, reaching to steady the maimed prince as he was lowered upon the ledge, lost his footing when the chain whipped loose. He fell 3 body lengths, slammed against the rock, and caught an iron spike hammered there by Morgoth's smiths. For an instant, the two cousins saw one another clearly through the ash. Fingon's face was cut and blackened, yet his eyes were bright. "Go," he said first, because he saw the arrows. Then he saw that Maedhros was staring not with pity, but with calculation, with the terrible coldness of a man who has been taught too long that pain is all the world will ever give him. Or come back. Thorondor cried out in the speech of eagles, harsh and ancient. One more descent, and he might lose both. One more circuit of those arrow-crowded crags, and he might fall out of the air with the son of Feanor crushed beneath him. Maedhros could still have ordered the risk. He could still have cast himself from the ledge onto the chain and died where Fingon hung. He could still have answered friendship with ruin shared. Instead, he gripped the feathers at Thorondor's neck with his remaining hand and said, very low, "No more." The eagle turned. Fingon watched them rise. The orcs reached him before the blood stopped running down the cliff. In the camp by Lake Mithrim, the watchfires burned blue in the wind and reflected in the water like shattered spears. Fingolfin had not slept. His people moved quietly that night, for all knew where his eldest son had gone, and what mountain stood between him and return. A fisherwoman, drawing in a frozen net before dawn, heard the first murmur among the sentries, and saw a shape descending out of the northern dark. For a single breath, she thought hope itself had taken wing. Hope came down broken. Maedhros was carried into the lamplit circle, wrapped in cloaks stiff with blood. Maglor walked beside him with a face like carved grief, and behind them the eagle rose once more and vanished southward, unwilling to come under the eyes of so many grieving exiles. Fingolfin stepped forward before any healer. "Where is he?" Maedhros looked at him, and the silence between them felt longer than the ice. "He found me," Maedhros said, his voice rasped like stone dragged over stone. "He freed me. Orcs came. There was no path back. It was not a lie, and because it was not, it struck with a liar's precision." Fingolfin did not weep before his host. He only nodded once, as a king acknowledges a wound that cannot be stanched in public, and ordered the healers to their work. Turgon turned away and struck the butt of his spear into the frozen ground until the shaft split. Finrod watched Maedhros' face and saw that something had been omitted, not from malice alone, but from a cowardice rarer and perhaps worse. The cowardice of a soul that already knows its own measure and cannot bear to name it. That night, Maglor remained in the shadowed tent while the healers bound the stump and fed Maedhros bitter draughts. At last the others left, the lamp guttered. Outside, the whole shore of Mithrim listened to the wind. "Did he die there?" Maglor asked. Maedhros shut his eyes. "Did he die there?" his brother repeated. "No." The word was almost soundless. Maglor waited. He had been the gentlest among Feanor's sons, but gentleness did not mean weakness. It meant he knew exactly how much a word could wound. "What did he say?" "Go," Maedhros answered. Then he said, "Or come back." Maglor's hand tightened on the edge of the cot. "And?" Maedhros turned his face toward the tent wall. "I did not. There are choices that pain explains, and choices that pain merely reveals." From that hour onward, Maedhros understood that Morgoth had not only maimed his body. He had discovered the fracture in his spirit and pressed until it opened. In the days that followed, the Noldor arranged themselves for war as they had in the true history, but with one nerve severed. In another world, Maedhros would have knelt to Fingolfin, yielded the high kingship, and by humility restored what pride had torn. In this world, he could not. To cede openly would have required him to stand before Fingolfin and confess that Fingon had bought his freedom with blood and been left in payment. To claim openly would have meant civil war. So he chose the third road, which seemed prudent and proved deadly: silence. The sons of Feanor withdrew eastward sooner and more completely, fortifying Himring and the marches beyond. Fingolfin held Hithlum and the northern passes west of Sirion with a colder heart. Between them lay not only leagues of frost-rimed plain, but a grief no herald could cross. No great feast of reunion eased the Sindar's suspicion. No laughter rose among gathered lords beneath stars unmarred by smoke. What feast could heal a silence like that? Across Beleriand, the change was felt first by those whose names the songs did not keep. A potter in Nevrast found that fewer traders came by the coast road, and that each one spoke in lowered tones. Herdsmen on Ardgalen saw beacon fires lit a little farther apart than before, and gaps between them where riders ought to have been. In Osiriand, the Green Elves watched new smithies kindling in the east and wondered why the bright folk from oversea did not move as one host if their enemy was one. Far to the south, over the long grasses, where in later ages the riders of Rohan would thunder, only wind moved, but even there the same stars looked down on division, ripening in the dark. Morgoth felt it. He had not won by force alone in the long years since the trees were slain. He had won by watching the proud hurt one another and then teaching them to call the wound fate. When his spies told him that Maedhros had returned without Fingon and that no parley of true reconciliation followed, he laughed in Angband, and the furnaces answered him. He did not kill Fingon. Why spend at once a weapon that could deepen over years? The captive was taken below first, into pits where steam rose from cracks in the stone and the walls sweated poison. He was questioned, starved, mocked with songs half remembered from Valinor and mangled by orcish tongues. He did not break. When lash and fire failed, Morgoth tried a subtler cruelty. Fingon was moved from the deepest cells to a high chamber cut into the lower shoulders of Thangorodrim, where at certain hours he could see, far beyond the smoke, a strip of grey northern sky. The dark enemy knew that memory could be used like a rack. Often, in those first years, Fingon expected Maedhros to return. He did not curse him immediately. That was the sharper torment. He knew the wound, the shock, the arrows, the eagle bleeding in the storm. He told himself for long months that some necessity had delayed the rescue, that some larger design was being laid, that if he endured one more winter or one more summer of heat-blown ash, he would hear again the beat of wings. But seasons passed and no wings came. At last, he understood. The understanding did not make him hate Maedhros. It made him lonely. In Hithlum, hope changed shape rather than dying. Fingolfin sent scouts north under moonless skies, and none returned with tidings worth the name. Turgon rode to the edges of Dor Daedaloth, and heard only the groan of iron from the mountain and the far-off hammers beneath it. Once, in late autumn when the reeds by Mithrim were silver with frost, a patrol came back swearing they had heard a voice singing from the north, not in triumph, but in endurance. The song was one Fingon had loved in Aman, a hymn to stars above the sea. Men of later ages would have called it impossible that so faint a sound should carry so far. Yet grief is a keen listener. Fingolfin heard it too. He went with only a handful to the desolation before Angband, and there at twilight, as the light bled out of the west, the wind bent and brought him a strand of melody thin as ice over black water. He did not call out, for kings do not cry into the enemy's teeth what the enemy already knows they desire. But when he returned to Barad Aethel, something in him had hardened into a blade. He sent for Maedhros. The meeting took place beside the upper waters of Sirion, where snowmelt ran clear over stone too ancient for any oath of the Noldor. Finrod came as witness. So did Maglor. They stood beneath a sky of hard blue, while ravens turned high above them. Fingolfin did not waste ceremony. "My son lives." Maedhros said nothing. I heard him. Still nothing. Then Fingolfin stepped closer, and even Maglor moved as if to intervene, for there are angers before which prudence seems frail. "Did he call to you on the mountain?" "Yes." "Did you leave him?" Maedhros lifted his maimed arm, looked at the banded stump as if seeing it from a distance, and answered with the truth stripped bare at last. "I chose to live." A long silence followed. Snowmelt whispered between stones. Finrod closed his eyes. Maglor bowed his head. Fingolfin's face changed less than any had expected, and that made it worse. Grief had already prepared the chamber where wrath would sit. "Then he is where your courage ended," he said. "Do not speak to me of kinship again, unless you mean to climb the mountain a second time." Maedhros might have answered with pride. He might have invoked the oath, the war, the burden of leadership. He said only, "I have no words that are not ash." That might have been an ending. It was only the close of the first act of ruin. Years lengthened. The siege of Angband held, but imperfectly. In the true tale, shared trust made watchfires into a wall. Here, every captain guarded his own front with suspicion toward the next. Orcs found seams. A village in Maedhros burned because help from the east came 2 hours late, and from the west not at all. A tower on the marches of Himring fell because a messenger feared to pass through another lord's land without seal or escort. How long can a realm besiege darkness when its captains do not trust one another? Maedhros ruled the east sternly and well enough that none could call him idle. He trained his sword hand to the left. He learned to mount and fight and write again. Smiths in Himring heard him striking at practice before dawn, the blows uneven at first, then cleaner, then terrible in their persistence. Yet even those loyal to him knew that all his labor had the rhythm of penance. Maglor's songs grew sadder. Celegorm mocked that sadness. Curufin despised it, and between the brothers, an old crack widened. The oath remained, but no vow can make hearts beat in unison. At times, under moonless weather, Maedhros climbed alone to the highest battlement of Himring and faced the west of Thangorodrim. There he would stand listening, though no man or elf beside him could hear anything but wind. Once Maglor joined him and found frost on the stones, silver on the prince's hair, and no cloak upon his shoulders. "Confess it before all," Maglor said, "not to ease yourself, to stop the poison from spreading unnamed." Maedhros did not turn. And what then? "Fingolfin hates me openly. My brothers are shamed. Morgoth learns the shape of our weakness. He knows it already. He knew it on the mountain," Maedhros said. Maglor looked north to where the dark towers hid beyond distance. "Then at least let the rest know what not to become." Maedhros laughed once, without mirth. "They know. They look at me and know." The revelation, when it spread beyond kings and brothers, did not come by proclamation. Morgoth saw to that. A year after the parley at Sirion, a single escaped thrall stumbled out of the fumes near the sources of Gelion, skin burnt by the steam vents of Angband, one ear gone, eyes blinking at daylight as if it were a blade. He was no great lord, only a Vanyarin archer from the first rising of the Noldor who had vanished long before the Helcaraxer was crossed. In a smith's yard at Himring, he drank water, shivered in the spring sun, and asked in a voice cracked to pieces whether Fingon, son of Fingolfin, yet lived among his kin. The yard fell still. Before any answer came, the man whispered, "Then tell them he waited." He died that evening. Some said it was poison soaked into old wounds. Some said Curufin's men hastened the end for fear of scandal. And in the east, that rumor ran like oil over fire. Nothing was proved. In dark times, uncertainty can corrode almost as deeply as guilt. Thingol in Doriath heard enough to turn his suspicion colder. Círdan heard enough to guard the havens with more care and less trust. The Sindar, who had never forgotten Alqualonder, now added Thangorodrim to the ledger of Noldoran pride. Finrod alone crossed these broken lines with steady hands, offering aid where he could, keeping friendship alive by acts rather than argument. It is no small thing that, when princes of the High Elves failed one another, Finrod, son of Finarfin, would one day keep faith to a mortal man. But that light had not yet reached its full shining. Morgoth loosed Glaurung sooner. The young dragon came out of Angband, not yet in his full age, but already vast enough to turn horses mad with scent alone. He crawled over the black plain in summer heat, while the grass ahead of him yellowed and curled from his breath. Westward riders under Fingolfin met him with shafts and bright helms. Eastward companies under Maedhros struck his flanks, but the timing was poor, each force acting on rumour instead of shared command. Glaurung was driven back at last by numbers and by the hard valour of many nameless captains. Yet, as he withdrew, sulphur and smoke rolled across Ardgallen and settled in the wells of farmsteads for weeks. Women drew up tainted water that smelled of rot and iron. Children coughed black flecks into their sleeves. Unease became certainty. The north was probing its cage. Then men came into Beleriand. The houses of the Edain crossed the Blue Mountains seeking lands and lords, and their arrival in this darker history mattered even more, for they entered a country where elf looked on elf with measured caution. The people of Hador found welcome in Hithlum because Fingolfin, for all his grief, still knew how to honour courage when he saw it. The house of Beor clung close to Finrod. Inihu met them with that grave warmth that asked no oaths first. In the east, Maedhros took service from the sons of Bor and the sons of Ulfang, perceiving keenly that he would need every spear if ever Angband were to be breached again. Yet, because no clear high king stood between rival realms, loyalties among men divided early, and seeds were planted that Morgoth would reap later with ugly harvest. The years deepened into a waiting all Beleriand could smell. Winters sharpened. Summers carried strange heat from the north. In Dorlomin, the sheep bunched nervously before storms. Along Sirion, marsh lights guttered blue where once they had been gold. Even the sea at the Falas seemed to beat more heavily, as if the coast itself listened for the moment the long restraint would fail. It failed in flame. When the Battle of Sudden Flame came, it came not as men remembered weather, but as the earth itself rejecting every root that had trusted it. Rivers of fire burst from Thangorodrim. Gases rolled across Ardgallen and turned the green plain to choking Anfauglith in a day. Watchtowers flared and vanished. Horses screamed in pits of cinder. Angrod and Egnor died amid their people in Dorthonion, and the pines there burned with a resinous sweetness so thick that survivors smelled it for years whenever ordinary hearthwood caught. In Hithlum, Fingolfin stood on a ridge blackened by falling ash and saw the ruin of the siege. He saw also, through gaps in smoke lit red from below, a figure upon the outer works of Angband, a tall elf in chains, hair whipped by furnace wind, singing. No one beside him knew the song. Fingolfin did. It was an old lay of Tyrion, changed now by pain into something harsher and more magnificent, a declaration that night had not yet learned to own every star. Morgoth had brought Fingon into sight at last, not out of mercy, but because spectacle is one of evil's oldest arts. Was he crueler for keeping Fingon alive, or wiser? Both truths served him. The king of Hithlum watched until the song was cut short by the crack of a whip or the slam of a gate. That evening, he spoke little. At dawn, he put on silver mail, took up Ringil, and rode from Barad Aithel with no more company than his wrath would tolerate. Those who saw him pass later said that even the horses bowed from his road. The duel with Morgoth still entered song, much as it had always done, because some deeds are too mighty to be altered, except in motive. Fingolfin came to Angband and struck upon its doors. Morgoth issued forth in black armour with Grond in hand. The earth quaked. 7 times the High King wounded the Dark Lord. 7 fountains of black blood smoked in the dust. Then the hammer fell. Fingolfin died beneath the shadow he had challenged, and the eagles bore his body away before the wolves could tear it. But in this world, as Morgoth limped back to his halls forever lamed, one thought burned clearer in him than triumph. A father had gone to the gate because a son had been displayed upon it, and the son was there because another son had once looked down and turned aside. Word of Fingolfin's death reached Himring in rain that smelled faintly of ash. Maedhros heard it standing over a table crowded with maps, and moved neither hand nor face for so long that the captains around him shifted in dread. At last, he said, "Then all my debts are due." He had no right to the high kingship in the hearts of many, yet power flows where necessity drives it. Fingon was lost, Fingolfin dead, Turgon withdrawing west into deeper secrecy. Finrod pressed on every side. The sons of Feanor still held broad lands in the east. Maedhros looked upon the ruin and did the thing he had not done when the wound was fresh. He chose the harder road. He sent messengers to every free realm in Beleriand. Not one letter named kingship. Not one asked pardon. Each said only that Angband must be challenged before the North consumed all, and that if Fingon, son of Fingolfin, still lived, he would not be left for Morgoth's sport a second time. The answers came unevenly. Maglor rode beside him at once. Caranthir came for war's sake. The Celegorm and Curufin came because no call to arms could be denied without shame, though both brought with them bitterness sharpened by recent disgrace from Nargothrond, where their treachery against Beren and Luthien had turned friend against friend and driven them out. That betrayal mattered now, for it meant Finrod was gone from the world, slain in a dark pit while saving the life of a mortal he had sworn to aid. In a time when ancient princes failed old companions, Finrod had kept faith to the death. The contrast haunted more than one campfire. Turgon did not come openly. He remembered Mithrim, the silence, the displayed prisoner, the father riding alone. He loved his brother still wherever he lived or suffered, yet distrust had become part of his statecraft. From his hidden city, he sent only veiled aid, and a promise that if battle turned past all hope, some strength might appear where least expected. Maedhros accepted this without reply. What else could he do? Could a war begun for jewels ever be redeemed by a single act of repentance? He would not live to answer fully. The host that gathered was mighty enough to make common soldiers believe, for a little while, that history had bent back toward healing. From the east came mailed Noldor under red and silver banners. From Hithlum came Hador's house, tall men in the wind with axes on their shoulders and frost in their beards. The sons of Bor marched grim and loyal. Even among the ranks of the less trusted Easterlings, there were faces young enough still to carry honest fear. Cooks boiled broth in iron cauldrons that smelled of onion and wet wool. Armorers worked by lantern light. In the night, a child of the Edain, born on campaign and too small to understand maps or blood feuds, laughed at sparks rising from a forge, and men nearby turned their heads because the sound hurt. Morgoth watched from his high dark and knew almost every move before it began. The union was later, narrower, and founded on guilt instead of shared hope. That made it easier to break. He fed whispers to the sons of Ulfang. He thickened the guard on the mountain paths. He ordered Fingon brought again to an outer height where any assaulting captain who broke through might see him and lose proportion. Battle opened under a yellow sky. The eastern host struck hard and drove the first ranks of Angband's armies back over the dust of Anfauglith. For an hour, perhaps two, it seemed almost enough. Orc lines folded, and trumpets of the Eldar rang clear as if the old siege had returned in one bright instant. Maedhros rode at the front with his red hair streaming under soot, and those who hated him still could not deny the ferocity with which he spent himself. Maglor kept close. Caranthir drove the centre like a wedge. From the west came Hurin and Hor with the men of Hador, and for a time their meeting with the eastern advance flashed like steel in sunlight through storm. Overhead, eagles wheeled where the smoke thinned. On a lower buttress of Thangorodrim, barely visible through heat shimmer, Fingon stood chained upright to black stone, his face turned toward the field. He saw Maedhros. Distance turned features to blur, but some recognitions do not require nearness. Fingon straightened as if a spear had passed through him. Maedhros saw the movement. I saw the gaunt frame, the white gleam of wrists in irons, and drove forward with the madness of a man who has reached the door of his own judgment. That was the moment Morgoth chose. The Easterlings under Uldor turned. Spear points that had faced Angband swung into the exposed flanks of the sons of Feanor. Caranthir's guard collapsed around him in a rain of black-fletched shafts. Celegorm, cursing men and fate alike, wheeled to meet the betrayal and took a spear through the throat before he had struck a second blow. Curufin dragged his brother's body clear, only to be hurled from the saddle by a troll's hammer and trampled into the cinder. The cry that went up from their companies was not merely pain. It was the sound of trust, finally dying in a host that had only borrowed it. Still Maedhros went on. With Maglor and a knot of his household, he reached the lower ways of the mountain, where slag ran in channels and the air tasted like hot knives. Orcs fought in snarling clusters among broken stairs. Balrogs moved deeper in, waiting. Above, Fingon watched them climb. He had imagined this moment in 100 forms during the years of captivity. In none of them had Maedhros' hair been so grey at the temples. At last they came within speech. Maedhros stood beneath the black pillar to which Fingon was chained, breastplate dented, face streaked with soot and blood not all his own. He had no shield. His left hand shook with exhaustion. I came back. Fingon looked down at him. The scars of old torment mapped his skin. One eye was clouded, yet his voice, when it came, held the same clear edge it had borne beneath the stars of Aman. You came to a battlefield. I came for you. Below them, the battle was already changing pitch, triumph flattening into slaughter. The mountain trembled with drums. Fingon's gaze moved past him to the plain where banners were beginning to fall. Then hear me, at last, he said. No throne was worth this silence. No oath was worth the years. Maedhros reached for the lock on the chain. I know. No, Fingon answered, not cruelly. You know only because time taught you what mercy would have taught in an instant. That wound struck deeper than any blade, because it was precise and because it was spoken without hatred. Maedhros bent to the manacle, trying to force it with sword and leverage. But one-handed strength is not two-handed strength, and the smithcraft of Angband had been made for despair. Maglor fought on the stair below, singing now not for beauty, but for rhythm, to keep fear from splintering the defenders around him. Orcs surged. Firelight flashed on whips and pikes. Then the chain gave. It did not open. A hidden bolt shot from the stone with the sound of snapping bone, and the whole upper fastening tore free. Fingon lurched forward over emptiness. Maedhros seized him with his left hand and caught for one terrible instant, not all his weight, but enough to stop the first plunge. The old image returned entire. Cliff, blood, one outstretched hand, the abyss waiting. Fingon looked into his cousin's face and saw at last not calculation, not fear, but absolute effort. It was too late. Below, a Balrog burst from the smoke onto the stair where Maglor fought, and the prince cried out. Maedhros' footing slipped on cinder. The broken chain burned between their wrists. Fingon understood before Maedhros did that the ledge would not hold, that if he clung, both might go, and all that remained of the assault would die in that one refusal repeated in reverse. "Do not fail the living for the dead," Fingon said. Maedhros tried to pull him up. Fingon gave a sad, astonished smile, as if only in that last instant had he seen the man Maedhros might once have been, had pain not reached him first. "This is the hand I waited for," he said. Then he struck the heated chain against the rock with his free wrist, shattering the last weakened link, and fell. No song records how long the scream lasted, because some sounds refuse music. Fingon dropped through smoke and furnace glare into the dark below the mountain works, and neither elf nor eagle saw where he came to rest. Maedhros lunged after him, and would have followed into the abyss had Maglor not flung himself up the stair, slashed the prince's harness free of a snagged spike, and dragged him bodily back from the edge, while the Balrog's whip cracked sparks between them. The retreat became massacre. Hurin and Hjor held the rear with the men of Hador, while Turgon's hidden strength, arriving at last like a blue gleam out of the west, carved a road for some remnant to escape. Hjor died beneath a cloud of arrows. Hurin was taken alive after a stand that left the corpses of his guard in a ring around him, like felled pines. Maglor carried Maedhros from the mountain half insensible, and the prince fought him every step, he trying to turn back toward a fire into which no living rescue could descend. That might have been the end of all free hope in the north. It was not, though hope afterward wore humbler clothing. Hithlum fell under the yoke of cruel men and watchers from Angband. In farmhouses that smelled of damp straw and old smoke, widows learned to speak softly when children asked where the bright lords had gone. Turgon sealed Gondolin more tightly, and the hidden city grew fairer and more doomed because trust had become too costly to spend. Maedhros returned east, a victor over none, ruling still because wreckage requires rulers too. He buried Celegorm and Curufin without tears where no singer stood. Caranthir's bitterness curdled into hardness. Maglor's voice, once golden, acquired a break in it that never healed. And yet, the age refused complete surrender. Beren still came out of Dorthonion with his impossible love. Luthien still sang before the throne of Morgoth and made the great enemy sleep. A Silmaril still passed through darkness in the hands of those who had less pride than any prince of the Noldor. Tuor still came at Ulmos bidding to Gondolin, and Idril still saw farther than kings. Eärendil still arose with the light upon his brow and sailed where no mortal should have found a road. Grace entered history by doors pride could not guard. At last, when the War of Wrath broke the towers of the north and the iron crown was beaten into a collar for the neck it had lorded over, there was relief in Middle-earth so profound it seemed almost silence. Captives stumbled blinking from pits into clean wind. Smoke thinned. For the first time in uncounted years, dawn lit some faces without the stain of Angban's fires across the horizon. Then the sea came. Beleriand cracked, drowned, and vanished under waves that cared nothing for grief or titles. The lands for which brothers had lied, bled, and butchered were swallowed until only fragments remained. In later ages, when shepherds would walk green hills in the Shire, when horse lords would ride the plains of Rohan, when the white city of Gondor would shine above Anduin, they would live upon a world shaped in part by losses so old that only songs remembered their edges. But old choices do not disappear because coastlines do. They sink and wait. Turgon died in Gondolin with too much secrecy around him and not enough trust. Húrin carried torment like a storm cloud after his release. Maglor wandered the shores with a Silmaril that burned him, and a memory he could never sing clean. Maedhros took the other holy jewel by force at the end, as the oath demanded, and his wiser heart already knew was useless. Its light scorched his flesh, because hands unhealed by repentance cannot keep stolen fire. In the true history, he cast himself away for oath and despair. In this darker telling, there was one more name upon his silence. Some say that as he stood above the fiery chasm, jewel blazing in agony, he did not cry out to Fëanor or to the Silmarils, but to Fingon. No answer came from earth or sky. What is doom, if not the weight of one refused hand carried through an age? Morgoth forged chains and dragons and pits of fire, but he needed only one moment of weariness, one calculation whispered at the edge of compassion, to turn the strength of the Eldar against itself. Maedhros was not damned because he suffered. He was damned because suffering became, for one heartbeat, the measure of what others deserved from him. That is why the tale endures. Not because it is grand, but because it is near. Kingdoms fall first in private. Long after the last banners rotted and the great names passed into books, mariners on the western coasts would sometimes hear an old elven lay born strangely over evening water, thin and almost broken, as if sung by someone who had spent ages trying to reach a single note he once failed to answer. They would stand very still, smelling salt and kelp and cold stone, while sunset reddened the waves where Beleriand had been. Under that dark water, where Thangorodrim was only memory and pressure and silt, the one black iron link still turned slowly in the deep, waiting for a hand that came too late.